Thank you very much, Giorgio, and good afternoon to you all, and a big welcome to Victoria generally and Melbourne in particular, especially for those of you who are visitors. Great to have you here. I'm going to discuss today Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy, and in that context you'll find that eventually I'm going to connect up pretty closely with some of the themes that Larry has described to you already. Particular themes of how do you do planning well, how do you integrate planning and land use, how do you meet a really rapidly growing population, and these issues of density and the best way to approach that. First, what I'll do is give you some context about what Infrastructure Victoria is and some of the work that we've done before I hopefully neatly connect with Larry. We are an independent organisation created by a piece of legislation by the Victorian government. And we are an independent organisation, and that is a really important feature of what we do. What I'm going to tell you today is the views of Infrastructure Victoria, not the views of the Victorian government. Our role is to be an independent, influential and very evidence-based advisor that the government and the community and other stakeholders can trust as we do three main things. One is this 30-year infrastructure strategy that I'm going to talk to you about. Secondly, we give independent advice to govern on specific tricky matters like, how big and where should we put major container ports, or how are we going to deal with the rise of automated vehicles. The third thing we do is research. Sadly for those of you who are from the university, it tends to be less at the university end of the research, although we do absolutely work with universities sometimes, and it's often at the very applied end of trying to get government policy to change as rapidly as possible. So there's a few key elements to how we operate. First thing is we are independent. And so it's all very well to say we're independent. What does that mean? Well, importantly, we're not a government department. And if Larry, in his former role in the planning department, wanted to tell us what we should do and how we should do it, we work very collaboratively with him, and then we make up our own mind. And we make that up on the basis of the evidence, because that is, for us, what's most important, to be very evidence-based. To consult really widely with government, academia, industry and the community, and to be transparent about that. And so one of the really different things about how we operate is that all of our modelling and all of our reports and all of our assumptions are published and transparent for everyone to see. And for those of you who've worked in or with governments, you might know that that's not always the case. And so that's quite a different feature of how we work. So throughout last year, we developed a 30-year infrastructure strategy for Victoria for the first time. And in February, we started by looking at where is Victoria now and where is it going to go in the future, and looking at some of these issues that Larry was outlining in terms of particularly population growth, the economy, social change and environmental change. Then we looked at a whole lot of options to meet the needs that Victoria has. We produced a draft strategy that we consulted on, and then a final strategy that was tabled in Parliament last December for everybody to see, and that the government has recently responded to, accepting wholly or in part nearly all of our recommendations. I'm going to give you a bit of a flavour of the strategy. I'm going to be merciful on you and not go through every single one of our recommendations. We had 285 quite detailed options about how we can meet Victoria's infrastructure needs, with a lot of evidence and analysis around that we consulted on. And we came up in the end with 137 recommendations. As you roll out over 30 years, the value of implementing those recommendations is about $100 billion. Now, I don't know about you, I could find a few things I could do $100 billion with. But that's absolutely within the capacity of the Victorian government to deliver over that period if it wishes to. Very importantly, we look at infrastructure in all sectors. So, of course, we look at transport. But we look at things that people don't always expect us to look at, like social housing we think of as a piece of infrastructure. Justice, health, education, parks, hospitals, to name some of the sectors. So we look at the integration of all of those sectors and how they work together and a lot of the codependencies that they have with each other. We are Infrastructure Victoria, not Infrastructure Melbourne. And so 70% of our recommendations relate across the state, and not everything is about building stuff. We have a multidisciplinary team, including some engineers. They love building stuff. But a lot of what we have to say is about better use of existing assets that we have. So policy change, regulatory change, pricing change, for example, and make quite a lot of recommendations about that. But we did have recommendations to government about building some really quite significant assets, both in transport space, some very large road assets and public transport assets, for example. Now, we had 137 recommendations, and then we did what I would recommend any parent not do, which is pick favourites. Because, of course, none of us like to say we've got a favourite child, even though one of them always says, "Am I your favourite daddy?" You say, "Of course not." But in this case, we did. So we wanted to call out perhaps something unexpected for many, which was that social and affordable housing is a pressing need in Victoria. And Larry has talked about the really large rising population in Victoria, which is a driver of lots of infrastructure demand. And we have had really quite strong economy for a long time, but there are some members of our society being left behind. And our estimate is that probably between 75 and 100,000 more households of stock, of social housing stock are required. That's a really very significant challenge. And so we called out the need for the Victorian government to invest and gave them quite a lot of different options and models by which that could start to be invested in. Second thing we talked about was introducing a comprehensive transport network pricing regime to manage demand on the transport network. You notice I said transport network pricing, not road pricing. That's because what we're thinking about here is you've got to look at the transport network as a system. That's hardly a novel observation, perhaps, but when people start talking about just road pricing alone, it doesn't look at, well, what does that do in terms of how people use the network? We did modelling, which of course we released because we're very transparent, about what's likely to happen with this population growth and the sort of investments that the government's already committed to make in coming years. And what we found that even with those large investments, we're looking at really significant congestion still. So just building your way out of that congestion is not going to get us there because you get induced demand on the network. And then what we did is we modelled a couple of scenarios on if you introduced, say, cordon pricing like they have in London, or some other forms of road network pricing and changes to public transport pricing. And that found that actually you can get quite significant uplift in transport system capacity. We're doing a whole lot of further work on that, thinking about all the different interventions you can make to reduce congestion, of which pricing is one very important one. Third thing, which I'm going to talk a bit more about, is we had a lot to say about increasing densities of residences in established areas of Melbourne and employment centres. And our angle on this is to make better use of existing infrastructure. We're not actually a land use planning agency, we're really interested in infrastructure, but it's pretty hard to disentangle the two. It is to some degree the holy grail is to properly connect up land use and infrastructure planning. So when we talk about increasing densities, that's applicable, of course, to Melbourne, which is a very high population and increasingly dense city, but also some of our regional cities as well, places like Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong. And what we're interested in here is, Larry talked to you about some of the zoning and the restrictions on height and areas where there can be densification of residences. And our view is that if you're going to accommodate the population that we've got now and coming towards us, and you're going to use the existing capacity that we have, particularly on our public transport networks, you've got to free up the capacity to have a larger number of residences, especially in the eastern and southeastern areas of Melbourne, which our modelling, which we've released, shows is likely to still have capacity on those transport lines. And so that's where we think, where you've got existing well-serviced areas, that's where some greater intensity should be allowed. And this is really difficult for local governments because no mayor and councillor is going to find it easy to say, yes, please, I want to have more people living here. I want to have higher density development here. So we think this is something where the Victorian government needs to take at least a lead in giving some sense of where should the priorities be, what changes should be made to the planning system, where do we need to be allocating and allowing for some additional population in areas where the infrastructure exists or can be easily retrofitted to meet that demand. So the other thing, and Larry described to you some of the employment centres, the large ones where there's really large towers coming up, and some of those, so places like Box Hill, for example. We certainly think, subject to high quality of development, which I certainly agree with Larry about, that those areas where you've got a capacity for people to live and work close together, that should certainly be possible. And with these established areas, which are in eastern and southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, we're not talking about putting high-rises everywhere. We're saying 4 to 6 stories in the right places, not everywhere throughout every municipality, but rather where there is good infrastructure and people can walk to good services that exist. The other thing we've said to the government is, you're a really big thing, government. You've got lots of departments and lots of agencies. One of the other holy grails, if you like, when you work in government is actually lining up what your service planning is and what your public sector infrastructure is. And we really could do better at that as well. And that is another way to integrate great land use and infrastructure planning. So the more that state, local and Commonwealth governments can be talking to each other about how are they going to deliver services, what infrastructure do they collectively need, how can they work together to deliver that, that's going to help as well. I've talked to you about the transparency of Infrastructure Victoria and how we publish all of our work. And so I would really encourage you to jump on our website and have a look at that. What we do is unique in Australia. There are other infrastructure advisory bodies. We are probably the most independent and most transparent of those examples, and we work very closely with the other advisory bodies as well. But this phenomenon that you see of independent infrastructure advisors is one that it seems to be growing as a way of increasing the quality of decision making, and it's designed to give people a wealth of information that not just government can use, but others who are citizens or proponents or stakeholder groups. So I'd encourage you to have a look at our website and keep in touch with us, where you can sort of see some more examples of the work we do.